Hello and welcome to another edition of the Center for American Institutions interview podcast. It is Wednesday, September 3rd, and we are coming to you from the beautiful Sonoran Desert in Tempe, Arizona. My guest today is another member here at the center, Dr. Joel Webster. Dr. Webster, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So Dr. Webster, tell me a little bit about your experience with the center. When did you get here, and what's your role here?
All right, yeah. I started just over a year ago. Started in July 2024, and it's been I think a really good experience where I get to lecture on material that I've never done before in some ways, right?
Okay, tell me a little bit about that. How is the material that you're lecturing on here or teaching here different from maybe your experience when you were a PhD student?
Absolutely, yeah. When I was a graduate part-time instructor, or finishing my PhD, I lectured only at the American Survey. So I did the second half of the US Survey. I'm a specialist in the 20th century. So lectured on that. And then here, our core curriculum that I teach, there's two classes really. The main one that is actually lecture based, Foundations of America or Foundation of Democracy. We start all the way back through cities and the Greeks, come all the way up through debates. There's 9 of them. We come all the way up to free speech in the late 20th century. And so with those, I'm lecturing on things that are kind of outside of, what I might teach in a survey class. So I've taught now, this is the third semester of doing lectures for that. I've done Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War. I've done social contract theory. I've done, and then usually I do, again, the U.S. stuff. As a U.S. historian, I do the U.S. constitutional debates, then Lincoln Douglas debate, and then I've also done Marx Hayek as well. So just very different than kind of the general U.S. survey, of course.
Interesting. And even though this is a historically based course, are you able to engage with it, bringing in maybe from a slightly different perspective than you would if this was a traditional American survey?
Yes, especially some of the debates I think kind of garner that more than others, because say like social contract theorist, right? That is very theoretical. It is very philosophical in many ways, much more than kind of I think you would address usually in kind of a U.S. survey class or general survey class of kind of any type, is that you're looking at kind of the nuances of some of these debates and these discussions. Other ones, again, looking more kind of maybe economics, Marx Hayek, obviously that you're kind of getting into the nitty gritty of some of that, more than you probably would in a survey class as well.
Interesting. And do you find that that maybe gives you a different, although this is not an American history course, do you think that it gives maybe the students a different perspective on American history than they're likely to get in a survey?
I think for some of them, yes. I'll give you an example is the Lincoln Douglas debate. So most people know Abraham Lincoln, right? One of the US presidents. However, I think most people don't really know about his career or his ideas or kind of who he was prior to the Civil War, right? Is if most are aware of him and all, it's about kind of that Civil War period and then his, assassination right towards the end of the war. But some of his ideas and some of his views and some of his politics before that are in some ways different. And so this class in particular gives that because the debate we see with Lincoln is the Senate debate with Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, who is the incumbent of the state. But their debate isn't so much about kind of Illinois politics. It's looking at kind of the broader questions of kind of westward expansion and the space of slavery in that, and who should decide on those types of questions, right? So it's a bigger, much bigger question in some ways, but multiple students throughout my time here have mentioned that it kind of gave them a different perspective on Lincoln than they had ever had before.
Hmm. Very interesting. Very interesting. Well, Lincoln seems like a good place to jump in a little bit to your own career because you're from the Shenandoah Valley, right?
I am, yeah.
So tell me a little bit about how growing up in the Shenandoah Valley might give you a bit of a unique appreciation for American history.
Yeah, so technically I was born outside Richmond, Virginia. So spent my first almost 7 years down there and then moved up to Shenandoah Valley. But my parents, in some ways, as well as the geography, enabled my kind of appreciation for history, I think. my mom was actually a history major in undergrad, and then my dad, while not a history major, he's always been a Civil War buff, and I went to pretty much every Civil War battlefield in the state of Virginia before I was 10, at least once. And then, like I said, with my mom, with her major, she was more into the colonial history, so I got a lot of that Revolutionary era stuff as well. And she'd worked at the apothecary shop in Fredericksburg, Virginia, when she was a teenager, and that whole appreciation for history, I think, I I once told someone that who's not from Virginia that it's a hard thing to understand, I think, for those who aren't from that part of the world, either in Virginia or kind of the original 13 colonies, if you will, in some ways, is it's almost impossible to take a step in Virginia without tripping over some sort of history. And that's colonial, that's Revolutionary War, that's Civil War, that's things since then as well. But, there's almost a Civil War battlefield in every county, it feels like. It's sometimes, and obviously that's an exaggeration to a small degree, but not really.
Well, and sometimes multiple in the same.
And sometimes multiple, on the same battlefield.
Right.
But yeah, no, I think that appreciation and that kind of saturation, if you will. I mean, in terms of history, wasn't an abstraction or a past thing. It was a very real thing, I think, in my life.
Right. I mean, I sense that when I've been to Virginia. It feels like you can still, the expression I use when I'm talking about Central Europe or Eastern Europe is you can still smell the blood,
Hmm.
right? The history is not gone.
Yeah.
And it is evident everywhere in
Yeah.
Virginia because, I mean, my goodness, so much happened there.
Absolutely.
It was the center of the, of significant aspects of the American experience.
Absolutely.
So do you consider yourself a historian of American conservatism?
I do.
Okay. So how is American conservatism, which is kind of a difficult concept, I think. I mean, you're laughing because I think you might know what I'm getting at here. But how is American conservatism typically defined by scholars?
It's typically defined, I think, by most scholars, serious or otherwise, that it's kind of a backwards, outdated, in some ways maybe an un-American
Hmm.
perspective on things. Is that you're looking at trying to change a way of life or revert to a way of life that, in some ways, can never be recovered or maybe never existed in some way. And there's a lot of argument, obviously, to this, but many scholars, I think, approach this with the sense that even trying to recover a past or find a past or reach backwards to find something, right, is impossible because America doesn't have that past. Is they
Hmm.
don't have the feudal system, they don't have kings, they don't have monarchs, they don't have any of that type of European aspects that are often attached to conservatism. But more importantly, I think, is that there's this sense that America was maybe founded on kind of liberalism, and
Hmm.
in the sense of not so much in how we apply today per se, but kind of free markets, free expression, uh, these types of things that maybe exist either outside of kind of a spectrum of kind of conservatism or modern liberalism, these types of things. But at the very least, it maybe can't exist truly in our system.
Hmm.
And in some ways, for example, if you think about it, many people who maybe consider themselves conservatives, what are they trying to conserve or what have they conserved, right? And if they're trying to conserve something, many times it's not something from, our founding fathers. It's from 20 years ago.
Mhm.
It's something that now is kind of mainstream anyway, and they're like, well, we need to defend this. We need to uphold this. So in many ways, it's complicated, and it's also one of those things that I think why so many people struggle to define it, myself included, in some ways, is that it can't be defined in kind of an abstract way.
Hmm.
It can't be defined by itself. Is that it has to be defined in relation to something else.
Sure. Well, so I mean, to put this another way, Marxism is defined by itself,
Yes.
right? There are Ur document. There is a gospel according to Karl
Yes.
Marx. that you can point to, and my goodness, there's a lot of debates over interpretation, but at least you can look at that and say, hey, this is an ideology in itself.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think liberalism, at least the classical liberalism, you can sort of point to the same thing. It's not maybe quite as discrete as the Marxist tradition,
No.
but there's this broader tradition of thought.
Yeah.
Right. But in conservatism, particularly American conservatism, who do you, where do you point to?
That's part of the issue.
Right.
And that's really, I think, the heart of the issue is that most people, I think, would try to point towards Edmund Burke. But see, then that's the issue is Edmund Burke, for those who don't know, is a English, well, Irish born technically, but it sits in Parliament, is a Whig.
Which, I mean, can you explain where the
Yes.
Whigs are?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So the Whigs are actually at the time the Progressive Party at the time. And so he is not seen as someone who is only upholding monarchy or only desires those types of things. But in fact, he does respect the institution, I think, at least in the English sense. And so that creates a problem again is for an American, how do you uphold that while also claiming, we don't have kings here and we won't have kings, right? And so that creates, I think, some problems. The other issue is that there's a ton of debate over who the founding fathers are conservative,
Sure.
right? And so if you get into that, you look at people who want to claim Jefferson is, then you have people who claim, no, he's a radical, liberal, and even maybe in the modern context or modern sense. But then you also look at maybe Alexander Hamilton. A lot of people claim he is. And I think in some ways, if for no other reason than the assumption, well, he kind of wanted maybe George Washington to become a king-like figure. And so there's that kind of connotation, kind of monarchism in that sense. But I think that that's part of the issue is that the foundation for that, at least in the American context, is weaker. As well as, again, if you contrast and very, generally speaking, contrast kind of European and American context, the European conservatives tend to be, if not completely monarchist, are favorable to that idea that somehow that type of system is probably good. And then they tend to be, and again, not exclusive, but they tend to be Catholic. They tend to be supporting that kind of like traditional institution of religion. And that also maybe having some inroads, particularly into social, cultural, and political life. And in the U.S., that's not really the case either. Conservatives come from all over the place. I mean, one of the most listened to conservative podcasts right now is Ben Shapiro, who's a Jew. So I mean, there's that distinction too, is that there's a wide breadth of people who kind of claim that label or have that label attached to them, which complicates things.
Right. I mean, I think I want to go back to your point. A point that you made that I think is really going to stick out with me is that American conservatism can really only be defined in its time, whatever is conservative at the time, in relation to something else.
Yes.
Um, because it does feel difficult to draw too many through lines between what might have been considered conservative in the 1920s and, Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, and then, conservatism in the 21st century.
Yeah.
It's really, I struggle to find those through lines.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I think maybe the best way to frame it is context matters, right?
Okay. Yeah.
And so
Spoken like a true historian as opposed to political theorists.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the context of this matters because I think if for no other reason, then it's very easy to want to ascribe labels to people who don't deserve them, both in a supportive way or a negative fashion, right? It is kind of looking back and saying, well, this person clearly is a liberal, or this person is clearly conservative, or this person clearly is whatever, right? There's some danger in that, and so the way I like to approach it and try to in my own work is, how do these people view themselves, right? And not just like their opponents. Do their opponents call them a conservative or a liberal or a radical or whatever it is? But more importantly, do they see themselves as abiding in that tradition? Right? Do they use the phrase to define themselves? How do they see their views? Do they see themselves as, being more progressive or being more, protective of the past or, that type of thing.
Mhm. Mhm. Interesting. Okay, so I understand that you're again, the importance of context. In the period that you study, which can you, give us a little bit of background on that, the
Yes.
period that you study?
Yeah, yeah. So generally, I'm looking at the bipartisan conservative response to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal in the 1930s. So my main focus right now is kind of the build up to his election in 1932, and then I stopped currently right before World War II breaks out, 39.
Okay.
So I'm looking at that response across both parties, particularly in the Senate, but kind of even more broadly in some ways is how are people responding to this? Is this a deviation from kind of the American process or the American idea of government, of the economy, of these types of things, or is it not?
Right.
Right. And then again, is how are these people dealing with these terms, dealing with these ideas in this time? Um, yeah, so again, mostly in the Senate, but I do venture out a little bit further.
Okay. So why is this an important period to study in the history of American conservatism?
I mean, it's important for several reasons. The biggest one being, I think that the New Deal in the 1930s is a huge moment of change. And again, not necessarily saying it's a deviation from the way America was or should be, right?
Sure.
But that it's a moment of huge government expansion and interaction between people and their government. Uh, and so if people are seeing that as concerning or problematic, either in terms of kind of the overall growth of the federal government and or more executive power in the hands of someone like Franklin Roosevelt, who again is going to be elected, for those who maybe didn't pay attention in history class, 4 times, unprecedented. We'll never see it again, probably because we've had amendment change that, but it's one of those things that it was unprecedented at the time, and many people were very, very concerned about what that meant for kind of the American system. Again, particularly context matters. Is Europe and parts of the other parts of the world are facing massive changes and challenges to systems of governments where you're having totalitarians, you're having people like Joseph Stalin, you're having Adolf Hitler, Mussolini in Italy, you have these people that are exhibiting power and control that is frightening to a lot of people. And the concern is, should a democracy like the United States in that context essentially have someone in power forever, maybe, right? And in some ways, maybe the only reason that we don't have 6 terms is because FDR can't live that long, and so in some ways, it's hypothetical, but it's hard to imagine that he doesn't keep getting elected if he's alive. I mean, and in some ways, that raises more questions about kind of democracy and power and all these things that I think come up and kind of digging into this is how are people perceiving this. And see, this is part of why I'm looking at the bipartisan nature of this too, right? Is it's easier to say, okay, people like Herbert Hoover who get beaten by FDR or other Republicans, it's easy to say, well, they're just bitter because it's the other side. It's a partisan question, right? But if people of his own party are raising some of the same concerns, to me, that's a fascinating thing of, okay, this is a concern. This is something maybe we need to pay attention to. Is this is not just uh, people, crying wolf or something like that, right?
So you're saying that, one of the reasons that there's there is this phenomenon going on, this bipartisan phenomenon of concerns about executive encroachment, about perhaps the establishment of some new form of executive, with Franklin Roosevelt, is that the New Deal is not only asking people to reevaluate the American experiment, their place within the American experiment, what they believe about the American experiment, and just ask new questions generally. So, I mean, I've heard it said that the New Deal is the conservative coalition is where modern political conservatism in America begins. is that an accurate statement, or is that are they building on something earlier?
Um, yes and no. Okay. I think that the modern conservative movement, in many ways, does kind of become a post-World War II phenomenon. And in large part, if for no other reason, then it gets back to our earlier point, right? Our earlier question of kind of who are these people looking to? What ideas, what tome, if you will, are they looking to? And in most cases, no one's looking to anything that anyone's writing in the 1930s or the 1920s or the 1910s or even earlier. Um, Most American conservatives probably aren't as familiar, even at the time, with Edmund Burke, who we mentioned earlier, or people like that. Is instead they're looking only after this period. They're going to start looking back at Iran. They're going to look for Hayek. They're going to look at people who maybe wouldn't actually consider themselves conservatives, but people are going to look to their writings as, well, this is an argument for us. And again, so in some ways it's a process where it's not just like there's a moment or there's a book or there's a person. Because in some ways, and people have made very good arguments about this, that in some ways it's this slowly kind of cobbling together of that. We get to Barry Goldwater in 1964, and then eventually, obviously, to Reagan in 1980. There's arguments to be made for that, I think. But there's also the sense that conservatism exists maybe even outside of just labels and places, and is that it persists. But the other point of your question, right, is what role does this conservative coalition have, right? This bipartisan conservative backlash in Congress. I think, in a certain sense, if it exists in the way that many people ascribe kind of this existence of power to, I don't think I don't think it actually has the power to build up this conservative movement. And in part because, and I've dug a lot, and there's still plenty to kind of sift through, but I have seen zero evidence of this coalition expanding its power beyond the walls of Congress.
Hmm.
Right? It has no impact on midterm elections, presidential elections. It has no impact. Not that there weren't attempts in some cases, but it has like zero impact on any of that.
Interesting.
What?
So it's really a corridors of the Senate phenomenon.
Yeah.
Interesting. So can you tell me a little like what is that one of your arguments that you make in your research?
Yes. And it's actually the main work I've done, dissertation, now hopefully turning into a book. The That's essentially where I end my argument with, is that maybe this thing didn't exist. And so what I end with is that question, but also there's evidence of conservatives working together, Republicans, Southern Democrats, some Northern Democrats as well, although they pretty much are gone in terms of conservative, ideology by into the 1950s. But there's a few of them, Gary in Rhode Island, Wheeler, Montana, folks like that are going to play a part in this. But that cooperation largely centers on court packing, 1937, where FDR attempts to try to add more justice to the Supreme Court, as well as some of the struggles between then and the beginning of World War II.
Hmm.
But after that, it doesn't seem to persist to the war. It doesn't seem to expand beyond that. And there seems to be very little cooperation after that period. And in some ways, that cooperation seems to be largely grounded in the friendship of Josiah Bailey, senator from North Carolina, Harry Byrd, senator from Virginia, and then, as I mentioned, Gary from Rhode Island. Is they are in like constant communication, sending letters, hanging out, spending a lot of time together, talking about these issues. But they're all Democrats, right? Um, eh, though they are working with and trying to have communication with Arthur Vandenberg, who's a Republican, the only Republican that kind of plays a big role at this period, it feels like, Republican from Michigan. And he's most famously known for being staunchly anti-intervention before World War II, and then goes on to become probably most vocally interventionist, pro-UN. He's a huge supporter of all that post-war.
Certainly in the Republican caucus.
Certainly within Republicans. Yeah. So he's playing a role.
And then Taft, maybe.
Taft doesn't come into late.
Right.
He doesn't get elected until 38, and then he's only there really for 39 before the war.
Right. Okay, that's right in your period.
And not that he's not, vocal and impactful to them, but becoming kind of Mr. Republican, he doesn't really become that kind of in that early period and really until kind of post World War II in some ways.
Interesting. And part of that would be that the Republican caucus until 1946 is pretty small. Between 32 and 46 is pretty small.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Very, very interesting. So, usually, and so I'm just going to maybe try to rephrase that a little bit. You're suggesting that the conservative coalition, the one that people accuse of being, that a lot of scholars accuse of being this giant, formidable obstacle to Roosevelt's agenda
And later presidents.
agenda. But, beginning as an obstacle to Roosevelt is an ephemeral thing that really only exists in the face of a couple of very specific challenges.
Yes. And more, and again, especially post Roosevelt, but definitely in the Roosevelt period as well, is, and this is future argument I'm planning to make and show, again, evidence for, or absence of evidence maybe in some cases, is that largely the conservative coalition serves in the minds of liberals and progressives and kind of left of center folks throughout the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, maybe even a little later, as a boogeyman.
Okay, as the reason they were not able to fully enact their agenda.
Yes,
it wasn't as if maybe there were other obstacles that prevented it, or that they flew too close to the sun.
Yes.
It was a conspiracy of a few conservative elites.
Yes.
Okay. And that you're saying that conspiracy is largely manufactured in the head of its opponents.
Seems to be. And again, so from extensive research already, that seems to be the way it is. One of the most fascinating pieces of evidence I've seen that made me reach this kind of conclusion is looking at not only mentions on the floor of the Senate, so looking through the congressional record for mentions of either directly saying you are the conservative coalition or similar accusations, comparing that to mentions of such a coalition in the Washington Post and New York Times. And I looked from roughly 1937, all the way up to 1970, from in this huge spectrum. There's almost no mention of such a thing, or even accusations of other phrases or anything like that, of that type of collaboration between the Republicans and the Southern Democrats, really until about 1958, which coincides, with an uptick in civil rights legislation push by mostly, again, Northern Democrats, but also some Republicans as well, like Jarvis out of New York. But it coincides with that, but also coincides with one of the largest incoming kind of young freshman senatorial classes and House member classes.
A class that fought World War II, by the way.
Yes. Almost to a man fought World War II. But it brought in a bunch of young men who didn't want to wait for action, because that's kind of getting into some of the structural things with the Senate and the House. But usually freshman members of either chamber, they're not usually allowed to make a lot of speeches. They're not allowed to take on big roles. These men didn't want to wait. And in the House in particular, there was a group called the Democratic Study Group that formed. And so this is before, the internet is before the ability to kind of find a lot of these questions very easily. Is they started doing tons of research on their opponents. They started doing tons of research on legislation. And they started having all this, again, to basically just disperse. Well, they're one of the groups who starts pushing this concept of the conservative coalition in both the House and otherwise. And that's when you see a huge uptick, especially with the New York Times, where it goes from maybe a dozen mentions before 1958 to from 58 to like 61 or 2, you're seeing somewhere around like 50 every year.
Interesting.
So massive uptick.
Interesting. Interesting. So, um, this notion of a conservative coalition is partisan in the sense that, but it is a partisan notion, but not one that would necessarily take hold before 58 in the minds because the Democratic Party had to change enough.
Yeah.
At least the Democratic Party and bringing Republicans a little bit as well, but interesting.
Well, and one more example. I mean, you look at supposedly seen as the legislation that kind of is the high watermark or the pinnacle of conservative post-war power is the Taft-Hartley Act, labor bill, 47, 48, 49. That kind of period is when this fighting is all happening about it. There's not a single mention of the conservative coalition. And again, Robert Taft, you mentioned earlier, he is leading this shortly before his attempt to run for president and his untimely death. But he's one of the people whose name is attached to this, who is seen as by many as like one of the most conservative members in Congress, which may or may not be the case, but he's seen as that by many, many people. And yet the newspapers are not reporting this as, conservative coalition running roughshod over Congress and over the president and over whatever. Like it's almost ignored in that context. And it doesn't really make sense. And so, seeing mentions of the conservative coalition or such a collaboration on this issue seems completely absent.
Interesting. And going back to one of your earlier points, you said that you try to take people at their word. What do they think they are? Would people that are later accused of being members of the conservative coalition, would they have considered themselves conservatives?
That's a fair question. Yes and no, I think. And again, I think it depends on who
Sure.
we're talking about, obviously, right? There's also some issue that until there were like required standards of maintaining records, some of these centers, they completely curated their collections before they ended up in the archive.
Sure. I mean, Walter George in Georgia just decided to burn his.
Yes, and that was very common, actually, before his time. He's one of the, like, the last few who really kind of does that, but that was very, very common is, these guys would just get rid of them. One who is a little later than George, but is considered by most to have heavily curated, even though there's still some pretty juicy stuff in there in some cases. But Harrisburg, Virginia, I mentioned earlier, and he's one of the longest serving senators kind of in history, and his collection, there seems to be a lot missing.
Interesting.
And so in that case, it's sometimes hard to tell for sure. Um, but there's ways, and again, technology changes some of this because by the time you get into like the 50s and 60s, nobody's really sending letters anymore. So there's like that written record of correspondence is kind of gone for the most part. But in some of that earlier period, that's where you can really see, what these people think in many cases. And I mentioned Josiah Bailey earlier. He's got one of the greatest collections ever because this man, unlike some of these others who burned their records or cleaned out their records, this guy kept a copy of every letter he ever received and every letter he ever sent. So not only are you getting, his point of view, but you're also getting kind of some like conversation that's happening as well. And in many cases, he's writing very confidential letters to friends, and he's, bearing his heart politically speaking in some cases where it's not, it's not the same thing that he's saying in a public speech or he's saying even on the floor of the Senate. It's, I think this man's dangerous, and this man being FDR or, these types of things. He's very clear about his concerns and his motivations and that type of thing. Again, I think, can you take that fully at face value? Probably. But in some cases, again, we have to be critical of our source material.
Sure. And speaking of your source material, for your work, you've done a lot of work in individual senators' archives.
Yes.
Which is a challenge because that requires going to a lot of small towns across the United States.
Yes.
Where these collections are kept. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What that experience was like?
Yeah. So that was, I mean, to me, it was one of the most rewarding experiences in a lot of ways. And luckily, I was able to visit UVA's archives because they're about 30 minutes from my parents' house. So I would go home and visit them while I was doing my dissertation and before my dissertation, and was able to visit there without too much struggle to see both Harry Burr's papers and his Senator Carter Glass papers there as well. But by and large, the big bulk of my project, I ended up getting several pieces of funding, including a very generous grant from the Dirksen Center to fund my congressional research. But with that, I was able to go, let's see, to about 7, 8, almost 9 archives, I guess. But I spent basically a summer, 3 months roughly, you know, 8 hours every day, uh, every week, going into the archive and looking at these papers of, as you said, senators, but also in some cases, some other political leaders, like the chair of the Democratic Party during the 19th, for most of the 1930s, saw his papers as well. But to me, it was the work that needed to be done because, as we talked about, many historians and many political scientists will claim that, this conservative coalition was this powerful group, and yet few of them have actually spent a time in too many of these archives, digging through these papers, um, and seeking out, really kind of, and then trying to understand who these people are and what they believed, and because in some ways that's what it's about too. It's not just about this potential collaboration or this cooperation, this conspiracy or whatever you want to call it, it's happening, but also, again, what do these men believe, right? What ideas do they hold? And so the papers, by and large, especially, like I said, Josiah Bailey's, I mean, it's a treasure trove, and there's so much there, and there's so much trying to like make sense of the complications of kind of how, especially, I keep going back to Bailey, but Bailey is so clear because we have so much of his material of how torn he was. He wanted to be a loyal Democrat. He wanted to be loyal to his party, to his president, to all these things. And yet he saw some actions that were happening with the FDR administration as being dangerous. And so, he's sitting there going, and you can like see him tearing himself apart in his writing where he's like, I must be loyal. I must support my president. I must support my party, but they're wrong, and how do I handle that?
Right.
And so you really see that come out in Bailey's material, even more so than some of the other folks. Although with others as well. But with him, I mean, it's so stark and it's so clear. Um, and again, to me, that's what being a historian is all about.
Yeah.
Is digging through that material, digging through those sources, and in some ways, reaching conclusions that you didn't expect. Because I mean, I completely went into this project thinking I was going to find evidence of this coalition existing and being powerful and doing all the things that everyone like attributed to it. But then I kept digging and I kept digging, and it was like, there's nothing here. I mean, at least in that sense. Um, and, you know, at least in terms of kind of this very strong cooperation, this very clear cooperation that wasn't just based on individual pieces of legislation or something like that.
Right. Um, I want to put a pin in that Bailey conversation because I have another question to add to that, but it's going to take us totally off the rails.
That's fine.
So we're going to put a pin in that to the end, okay, and then we can go off the rails at the end. Um, before I really let this conservative coalition thing go, I want to put on my hat of the traditional scholarship in the field here for a second.
Yeah.
One of the things that the conservative coalition, especially the Southern Democrats that are members of the so-called conservative coalition, are accused of is doing it for racist purposes in the preservation of the racial caste system in the South. Um, what is the role of race in this group of conservatives in the United States at the time in the conservative coalition, so-called conservative?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. From what I came across, at least in terms of kind of reasoning, justification, both kind of individual as well as trying to build a coalition or trying to build support for legislation, that type of thing. I saw, again, maybe it's not there, or maybe it was, some of the things that were removed from some of his collections or something like that, if there was a piece of evidence like that. But I found zero evidence that race played a major role during this period. Now, again, I think once you get a little later, I think it does play kind of a bigger role, at least in terms of bringing the Southern Democrats together. But in terms of trying to build bridges with the Republicans and this bipartisan sentiment and try to build a bulwark against the New Deal and FDR and all these types of things, race doesn't seem to play a part.
Interesting. So you're saying that, I mean, is race not influencing some of the Southern Democrats' perspectives on the New Deal?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, individually, again, for the Southern Democrats, I think many of them do hold views that we would consider racist or just outwardly racist. However, again, in terms of them trying to appeal to maybe their Northern Democrat friends or their Midwestern Republicans, they're not bringing up race. In most cases, they're not even bringing up other issues that we think of in this time as well as labor. They're not really usually bringing up foreign policy, because foreign policy, and that's something, again, most people kind of ignore too, is that foreign policy creates completely different alignments in the Senate, in the House, in kind of, the society more broadly. And so in some ways, the issues we think of as kind of dominating politics, particularly maybe in the 20th century, they don't seem to play a big role in kind of coalition building, or trying to, again, resist any aspect of the New Deal. It doesn't feel like.
Well, I mean, I would think that if you're talking about foreign policy or you're talking about race or you're talking about some of these other or labor, you're talking about issues that are likely to alienate your potential partners um, in these parliamentary games, particularly because, again, we're talking about something that, as far as you can tell, is largely a Senate corridors phenomenon.
Yeah.
Right. And people who are elites generally. So they're less, and in their communications with each other, they're probably less appealing to the base, which might have more stark racial views than the senators themselves. So not in every case.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. For me, the Senators, that's absolutely true. And then there's the other, I mean, too, and this is kind of getting into broader question we're talking about too, is many of these senators, even though, again, at their time or especially since, that we would probably consider, extremely racist type folks, they're, in their mind, many of them saw themselves not as racist, but as actually progressives on race. They saw themselves as actually trying to, walk a better path. And in some ways, maybe they were. In some cases, I mean, these people who, again, are often, painted as, racist, Josiah Bailey, Tom Conley of Texas, you know, in many, many examples. And again, they're probably doing so out of some kind of like paternalistic, noblesse oblige kind of mindset, right? But in both cases, both those men who are lawyers, again, very, very common for a Southern senator in the 20th century, they're both lawyers, and both of them made, on many occasions, attempts to protect blacks in the court system, which in a segregated South is a dangerous place to be, right? And so they both made numerous attempts to do that. Now, again, does that mean they're not racist? No, not necessarily. But at the same time, someone, it's hard to I think justify that in some way if you also expect those same people to be, Ku Klux Klan members or whatever, right? That doesn't seem to make sense, right? But it also shows that race has been, was, and will be a contentious issue in the South, and it's one of those things that people, no matter exactly their point of view on it, they have to dance around that in some way. Again, especially when appealing to the base or running for office or whatever, is that is clearly a bigger issue kind of locally than it maybe is on the national scale.
right. And if you're trying to build a national coalition for something, it's something that can sink you.
Yeah.
Whereas, however, it might be necessary at the local level.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah. So you're speaking to different audiences. Again, context matters. Right.
Right. Context matters. Right. So I want to fast forward a little bit to today. The American conservative movement has gone through a pretty substantial metamorphosis in certainly the last 10 years, but arguably more earlier than that.
Yeah.
Where do we see we might call the MAGA movement? Where do we see that movement in the trend of historical conservatism?
It's a really good question. In some ways, part of me wants to say it's not really truly conservative, right? And I think it's easy to make that argument because most of MAGA or that group, they seem to want drastic change, right? And our assumption is, well, change can't be conservative. Well, I'm not sure that's the case either, but there's also then something to be said for kind of the leader or the head of that, Donald Trump, right? Is that at a certain level, again, he's not a conservative. I'm not sure he sees himself as a conservative. And yet, he has accomplished things that conservatives have been dreaming of for decades or more in some cases. And yet, many conservatives take issue with that. And again, especially depending on the type of conservative, but many of the religious conservatives obviously are very concerned about kind of his infidelity and his many wives and all these other types of things, right? That complicate things. But from a just kind of a political point of view, I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure it's entirely conservative, but it's also not conservative, right? It's there's huge aspects of it. I mean, some of his things, like his pushes right now for, you know, education and, very kind of pro-American history. I mean, those are types of things that American conservatives have wanted for a long time is a sense of, having a positive outlook of the nation, even though we understand we're not perfect. We understand we have problems. We understand all these things. But to say they're still good. There's still things we should cherish. We should appreciate, and that our narrative shouldn't be always "woe is me" or tear it all down or burn it all down or whatever. Is that it shouldn't be that either. And so, some ways there's aspects like that that clearly there's some conservative influence. Now, again, is that because of the man at the head of it, or is it some of his advisors? Is it I'm not sure what it is, or is it just like much of politics? Is it just a reaction? You know, backlash to kind of the pendulum going the other way as it maybe had since the 60s or 70s, right?
Sure. So again, as you've articulated earlier, it's the context mattering, that you can
Yes.
only understand conservatism in a particular American historical era, unlike perhaps in Europe and other parts of the world,
Yeah.
that American conservatism is v not entirely, but largely context-based. And so because the MAGA movement is not the so-called woke movement,
Yeah.
it is by definition conservative.
Yeah. It's at least center right or
Sure.
center or right of center or that type of, I mean, it has to be at least, again, by comparison, right, at the very least, right? But then there's also, and this is something that I think that gets overlooked or kind of misunderstood maybe is part of why it's hard again over time, I think, is that and we're looking at a very short time here we're talking about, here like 20th century, 21st century is for the American situation, right? Is the issues, the questions, the concerns of the day, they're different, right? During, you know, intervention or non-intervention, New Deal, those are economic issues, those are foreign policy issues. By and large, those same issues don't exist today. Just like the Cold War questions that persist, you know, for most of the post-war period is you know, those questions, those concerns, those dividing lines, they aren't the ones that are today. The ones today, by and large, and again, not that there aren't some foreign policy questions, like obviously, should we support Ukraine or not? Those types of questions, right? Whereas China threat or not, or Israel Palestine, not that those don't exist and they're there, but I think by and large, those aren't generally, at least most people aren't thinking about them as kind of a bigger question than that specific case, right? Now, again, there are exceptions, but many people, I think, see those as kind of individual case concerns. But most of the questions, most of the issues, most of the dividing lines tend to be much more cultural, much more social questions, abortion, gay rights, then those things. I mean, again, dating back to the 60s, 70s, from then on, those have really been the questions that are really kind of dividing, creating the reference points for who's conservative, who's not, who's right, who's left, who's whatever is those questions. And, for example, this, you can see, Barry Goldwater, who's seen as like the conservative when he's running for, president in 64. Well, he is very much against most of the cultural questions that, the moral majority, religious right who helps get Ronald Reagan elected in 80. He's very much against them moralizing these things and kind of bringing religion into every question. And there's other folks like him that are seen as kind of these champions of conservatism, but yet on many social issues, actually, cases of him as well as Gore, that is, and Phyllis Schlafly, who is again a big name and big figure in that period as well. Both of those people on social questions, they tend to lean a little more left by the end of kind of the 70s, 80s, 90s even, because on a personal level, you know, the question of maybe, gay rights or gay marriage or those types of things are much more at home to them because they have family members who, identify that way. And so that becomes a bigger, more personal question of, well, it's not just like abstractly, this is reality, right? And so they maybe don't align the same way you would expect on a, bigger social cultural question as they would on like the Cold War or equal rights amendment, that type of thing.
Right. Right. Interesting. I mean, and your comment on how modern conservatism is becoming, or when I say modern 21st century conservatism, is becoming so culturally referenced or culturally determined.
Yeah.
I mean, when you're talking about the conservative coalition during the New Deal, it sounds like it's procedurally determined.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways, the things that do, like what exists as a conservative coalition, or what you might call the conservatives in the 1930s, which again, you're saying that obviously they're, and maybe because these things are institutionally determined, there's no real chance for them. They don't actually have many commonalities outside of them agreeing that Roosevelt should only run for 2 terms.
Yeah.
Or we shouldn't pack the courts. There's a way there's a procedural, there's institutions that we need to protect.
Yeah.
Right. And in that way, maybe there's something you can call conservative there.
Yeah. Well, and then there's also, I mean, some of it's too about, if you think about the geography of the United States, things have dramatically changed too. As we mentioned the term already, Southern Democrat, the North-South split, Civil War, post-Civil War, that split persists for at least until the 90s, really, 1990s, in many ways, in terms of determining the allotment of political power, right? But most people misunderstand or misrepresent the same chasm that seems to exist in the Republican Party. Is there seems to be a east-west split is actually how I would determine that one. But it's also is that it's such a strange thing too, is that it used to be a coastal thing too. What Republicans did is they used to dominate actually the West Coast, which is almost unfathomable for most of our listeners today, probably to think about it as like California being a consistently red state. Same thing with the New England states. They start shrinking towards the middle of the country, and that kind of east-west line kind of disappears again by the 1990s, really, in many cases, where you end up with the same splits we have today, which is largely kind of your New England Northeast, your West Coast, staunchly Democrat, your South, kind of Midwest, being consistently more Republican. And that, doesn't just happen. It doesn't just happen because of civil rights bill. It doesn't just happen because of any singular issue. It happens for many of these reasons, again, about how these realign, as well as mobility. Huge amount of mobility that changes not only spread of information, but allows people to not live in the same town their parents did. They end up going somewhere else. And again, not only that, expansion of education, people going to colleges and then taking jobs elsewhere, particularly because of that, or just realizing there's a whole other world out there, so I want to go live somewhere else.
Right. So that's creating this. People are taking their ideas that maybe they grew up in their hometown with and moving somewhere else with them, which is breaking down the traditional local political cultural views that might have existed previously.
Yeah. And twisting people's perceptions too, because, everyone's like, oh, at least the argument's been Texas is going to turn blue or purple sometime soon. That's been the projection since before I arrived doing my dissertation, Texas. That was the argument. what hasn't happened, but also we perceive that Texas is deep red, or that it's too red, or it's very red, it's very conservative, it's very Republican, it's very whatever. And yet, more people in the state of California vote for Republican on every single presidential election ticket in the last 10, 20 years than to do in Texas. But we don't consider California a Republican. We don't consider it conservative because they don't go anything but blue anymore. But the reality is there's a ton of Republicans, a ton of conservatives, there's a ton of people who don't go along with the status quo in that state. And so that's one of the things that I think kind of gets lost in some of this too, is how this political map has changed, right? Consistently. Is that, but it's also, again, is that it's harder geographically to kind of just claim that, these states are this way. And in some ways it's because, again, most people think kind of on a national scale, but if you really look at some of these states, a lot of these states are split. Is you're going to have a Republican governor, and then you're going to have cities that are run by Democrats, or vice versa, right? Is that almost no state is that clearly just dominated by one party that there is no chance. There's a few that are close, like California's gotten to the point where it's very hard to run as a Republican and win as a Republican in that state.
At a statewide level.
On a statewide level, right? To be a mayor, like, being a mayor of Los Angeles, so that we don't expect that anymore. But I mean, it's not impossible. It's not actually, something that can't happen. But again, we don't really think about it.
Although we look at Massachusetts and we see Republicans win in Massachusetts all the time, right? Or Maryland, we see Republicans win at the statewide level in Massachusetts and Maryland all the time, right? Even though these are as deep a blue states and the presidential elections that you can typically imagine.
No.
Okay, I did say we got 5 minutes left.
Okay.
And I did say I put a pin in a question that
Yeah.
I'd be. And I don't want this to go totally off the rails, but in mind, you mentioned that Josiah Bailey is in this moment. He wants to be a loyal Democrat, and he wants to support his president, but he's looking at his president and going, "You are shattering norms and institutions." And Josiah Bailey, whether he considered himself a conservative or not, is trying to protect the institutions and trying to protect the norms. This sounds awfully familiar to me in today's political context. I expect there's a few people in Washington that are enduring this exact dilemma. How did Bailey deal with it?
Not very well. No, I mean, at a certain level, I think he does, but you can clearly see, again, pretty much from the moment FDR gets elected until he's fully broke with him late 38, probably. At least privately. I mean, he's still publicly largely supported by them, at least when he has to be. But most of these guys, Bailey included, that find themselves kind of at odds. It's the question you mentioned, or the point you made, the institution concerns, right? Is that, and not just the institution concerns of like the Senate or the Supreme Court or executive power, but also something that he thinks that FDR and his administration don't appreciate is the Democratic Party itself is an institution. And it's an institution that has a past, a present, and a future. And in Bailey's mind, FDR and most of the New Dealers, if you will, just kind of generally speaking, he thinks they see it as a means to an end, and that's it. Like, it's not an institution. It's not something that should be venerated or cared for or passed on to the next generation. It's a tool, and it's a mask, maybe, that type of thing. And so for him, he sees them deeply disrespecting the traditions of that. And so in that way, I mean, to me, that's one of the clearest examples that maybe he is a conservative, is a sense is that he sees that as something that's like, his ancestors passed down to him. And again, for many of these guys, that's the truth. And, and again, something that I think we have a hard time understanding because of all the changes that have happened politically and culturally and societally, is that for many of these men, their forefathers had only been Democrats, right? I mean, when Bailey says this is what my family is and has been, he means it. Like, they did not know any other political party. And again, it depends on how exactly you want to define Jacksonian Democratic Republicans. Are they actually the predecessors to Jackson's party or not? I mean, there's a whole lot of political and academic disagreement about that, whether that's true or not. But even if it isn't, for most of these Southerners in most of these areas, especially states that weren't part of the original colonies, perhaps, a lot of these areas, they have only existed when there's been a political split of a Republican and Democrat, or Democrat and Whig, even in American context. But most of these guys, they can trace back to that and say, like, my great 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 grandfather was a Democrat. I'm a Democrat, and so and this is why, again, especially once this political divide seems to be loosening, or there starts to be concerns from the base, as we talked about, of saying, well, why are you supporting these presidents who are doing X? Well, it's not so simple to say I'm going to disregard the president of my party, or I'm going to disregard my party, because this isn't just some weak connection, right? These people see this as this is part of who they are, and like the deepest level is they are a Democrat just as much as they are an American, right? And so for many of them, trying to switch parties or leave the party or start a new party or do whatever is like, that's like heresy. That's like treason. That's, the worst thing you could possibly do. And so for most of these men, like, they don't see that as an option. And so in many ways, that's part of what means that if there is a conservative coalition, it only exists in Congress. That's part of the reason, is that particularly for the Southern Democrats, they will never be anything else. They can't be anything else. So
Interesting. Well, I think we can leave it there. Dr. Webster, thank you very much for your time.
thank you for having me.
And hopefully we can chat again soon.
Look forward to it.